Hi, I'm Lil Neuman. Welcome to Viewpoint. And today our guest is Senator George Latimer, and our co-host Susan Solomon isn't with us today. She'll be here next time. I want to thank you, Senator Latimer, for being here today.
Lillian, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to be with you today.
Thank you. You know, as we were talking before, there's a lot of ethics and stuff going on in Albany. People that have been there a long time have not there any longer due to irregularities. Could you tell us something about what's going on?
Well, it's pretty much been the tabloid headlines of what's come out of Albany, and there are some very important policy issues to deal with, but it's really blotted out by the scandals.
Right.
And over the course of the last 2 years, you had both the head of the Senate, Dean Skelos, the Republican, and the head of the Assembly, right, Shelley Silver, the Democrat, both indicted and convicted, right, of serious crimes. And if they were the only two, that would have been plenty, but you had the number 2 Republican in the Senate, Tom Libous, who was convicted of a crime, lost his seat, he subsequently passed away. And you've had some other members that have also fell afoul of one ethics or the other. The first thing to be said is that it's not all connected to one big scandal. Right. It's not a Watergate right. scandal or an ab scam where all of these people were part of it. These are individual acts of criminality right. that have been found out and dealt with. And it gives the person the impression, very logical impression, right. that they're all corrupt.
Right.
And so the stain is on all
That's
of us,
right.
whether we're involved in any of these dealings or not. I think the bottom line is for some individuals who are in positions of power, they don't see the way people in the everyday world see this.
Right.
And they see it as they're angry, they're frustrated by it, and the frustration is across the party lines.
Right.
This is not one party
That's
or the
right.
other that's either more angry nor more innocent nor more guilty.
Right.
And I think the proper response has to be an understanding that we have to take extra efforts to try to reestablish faith. We have done one thing already. We voted for pension forfeiture, in which if you have been convicted
right.
of committing a job-related felony,
right.
you run the risk of losing your pension.
Good.
Now, if you've been convicted, you lose your seat.
Okay.
You go to jail.
Right.
You lose the respect of the people
right.
who know you, but that hasn't been enough, so now we go the next step.
Good.
You lose your pension.
Good.
That has to be voted on again next year. It's a constitutional amendment. Then the voters will vote. But that's not enough. And what I would argue is that there's 3 or 4 or 5 more prescriptives that are needed. They basically come down to this, Lillian. You have too much power centralized in too few people, and you have too much money in the system. And where you have centralized power and you have excess of money, then you will have corruption.
Right.
Now, some people will say we need term limits. I could vote for term limits, but I know that's not going to solve the problem because you have members who've run afoul of the law in their first term or their second term.
Right.
So it's not just how long they've been there. There are people who've been there for a while who are honest.
Right.
There are people who just got there and they're criminals. But what you really need is you need a public and you need a press that watches more closely.
Got it.
And sometimes it's not that interesting to watch Albany. Right. It's not fascinating TV.
Right.
But if everybody knows they're under scrutiny, you get a better chance of ethical behavior.
Got it. And do you think, because with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton running, a lot of people are pointing to the government's corrupt. There's so much corruption going on and scandals, and that seems to be fueling why people want to vote for Trump, because he's not the
We have a couple of things happening, and of course,
politician.
when we talk about national politics, your opinion, my opinion, their opinion are all equal. I don't have any particular inside dope at the national level of politics. But the first thing I'd say is there's certainly a frustration, and it's expressed in part by the way Trump's popularity has exploded. The question is it an anger over specific things that can be changed,
right.
or is it a general anger? And I don't confuse me with details. I just want them all out.
Right.
And the latter part can't be satisfied because you'll have new people come in, and without an agenda of what reform is going to be, you won't get reform. But there's no question, as I go out in my district, and I talk to people all the time, there are a lot of folks who are unhappy. Some of it is that our economy has not rebounded from the 2008-2009 collapse. There are people out there who are still working hard, or they're not working at all. They're not seeing any growth in their income. You put a kid through college. I'm fortunate that my daughter's through college, but you put a kid through college now, you incur a lot of debt. When they come out of college, they don't have a job that's obviously available for them to get. Buying things that you hope over time that you'd saved up for, all of a sudden seems to move further away from you. And all of those things, I think, create a certain malaise in the society. Now, at the national level, they have to address this. And I think that the problem that I see when I look at the national elections, all negative. It is, you're no good, no, you're no good, and you cannot build confidence that way. You have to have a positive agenda, and you have to be able to at least try to show that you're sincere about that. That's what we have to do in Albany. Washington has to be Washington, and all the way down to the local levels.
So what are you seeing when you go out there and you talk to your constituents about working jobs that you don't make enough money to afford the things you want to afford? The big college bill, when your kids get out of school, you're stuck with a bill. They're stuck with it. I mean,
the only logical thing that you can say, and this is hard, and I'm in my early 60s now, so it's hard for me as it would be for other people that I talk to. You have to be prepared to accept the fact that the world has changed. Technology has changed. Opportunities have changed. You need to have different skills today than you might have needed 20 years ago. The thought that you could have gone in the path that your father did or your grandfather did, and they did it for a long time, and they had certain that isn't the case now. So what those of us in government need to do is we need to try to open up new opportunities. If it involves retraining skills, if it involves opening and enticing businesses to come here that have a different type of basis, and then you, the individual, have to relate to it a different way. We chatted about this off camera. The explosion of technology, social media, unknown to me. Facebook came along 2004, Twitter a couple of years after that. My initial reaction was, why should I do that? You have to embrace the change, and you have to recognize that the society is changing economically, and then also the society is changing socially. And the things that I saw when I was growing up in the late 50s, early 60s, and into the 70s are different now. And a lot of people are unhappy with those changes, but those changes have come because societal attitudes have changed. And you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So you have to try to figure out, where do I fit in to the society? How do I make a contribution, and then economically? Certainly government has its role, but government is not the only player in the game. And I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice if we expect, the politicians will turn the economy around. The business community has to, renew its efforts to try to be active in the community, and that goes to all the other things, the not-for-profit world, the clergy, and all those other players in the game. They're all players in the game, not just government. It's all of us together.
And I know the other show we had Kevin Burns, who was talking about keeping businesses. How do we keep businesses here in New York State? They're all going to North Carolina, South Carolina, Massachusetts. What do we do to keep businesses here?
Well, you have to look at what is the reason why a business would find New York desirable compared to North Carolina or North Dakota. The tax structure in the South is much less expensive. We all understand that. And in the South, they provide much less services. We have excellent educational services, much better than the states that we're talking about. We have mass transit. If you live here and you get on a train and go into the city, that's fine. If you live in Houston, the suburbs of Houston, Texas, you can get on a bus or get on your horse or get in your individual car. There's no mass transit. So there are certain things that are advantages in the New York market, but they come at a cost, and we pay for that in higher taxes. So what I would say is, New York is still, and certainly this area of the state, we're not here, we're not in Buffalo, we're here in the downstate section. This state is still the leader in financial services. We're the leader in fashion. We're the leader in media, news, and coverage of that nature. We're the leader in publishing. We have a host of industries that New York, Manhattan are home. And many of those companies have moved outside of New York City, and they've moved out into the Westchesters and the Fairfield counties. We have to provide incentives to keep them here. And they have to be incentives that are targeted to what the individual company will get them to stay. And some people say that's picking winners and losers. I was a salesman in the beginning of my business career. You customize the sell and the package to the customer. If you go and say, here's my one plan, it fits all, he says, doesn't fit me, I'm not buying you. And so I do think you have to look at each industry, and you have to try to reach out to those good businesses that are here. Now, in some cases, Lillian, you know as well as I know, you will find lower wage costs if you take your plant and you move it to Bangladesh, or you move it to Mexico and Vietnam, because there they don't pay the wages, the human wages that we pay here. And some of those businesses, when they go, aren't going to come back, and it would be foolish to try to compete by lowering all those standards. But I think you need to have an ongoing dialogue with your business community. You need to use the modern technology that's out there, promote what makes your community or your area of the state viable. And I will say that when you step back and take the big picture, we are not as healthy as we were 5 or 6 years ago, but we've come back a little bit. And certainly a county like Westchester, and I would say Rockland and Putnam and Suffolk and Nassau and New York City have done as good a job as you could expect given the climate. Because let's face it, if you want the lowest taxes, you move to North Dakota.
Right.
But if you move to North Dakota, you're not going to get the employee base. Right. The weather is not going to be very pleasant. So the companies stay in New York. They don't go to North Dakota.
Right. And you know what? Also, we're talking about this Common Core. I don't get it. To me, listening to parents and and teachers that I know, they say it's all focused. It's not really on learning. It's like memory. Can you explain?
Well, I'll tell you what. I've been an outspoken critic to the changes that have come into education, and as a Democrat, I have criticized other Democrats who have supported some of these changes. It's not one party or the other, but I want to be clear that I don't buy what I'm about to say because what I'm about to say explains the backdrop.
Okay.
You've had 3 or 4 major things happen in education over the last decade. You had the federal government pass No Child Left Behind under President Bush. That was followed by Race to the Top, a program under President Obama. And then now you've had this initiative, Common Core, which came out of the states, not from the federal government, but in every one of these cases, the mission has been to change the way you deliver education. And underneath it, the theory is we have to test kids more, we have to have standardized tests, and we have to track how they're doing against the tests. We have to track the teachers against the tests, and this will produce a better result. All of this is unproven. This is academic theory. I'll give you a quick example. I know time is limited. My daughter, who's now over 30, was in elementary school in the early 90s. And in those days, they taught English on a program called Whole Language. And Whole Language was teaching English differently than the way I learned it when I was a kid in the 60s. We learned phonetics and break a word down into pieces and you sound it out. So I couldn't even be helpful to her, in helping her study her language. Well, years went by. She was not a very good speller in elementary school. Later on in her life, she blossomed as an academically. She did well. College, grad school, gainfully employed, happily married grandkid. We did okay.
That's all right. You did okay.
But I found out from friends of mine that this concept of whole language to teach English, they scrapped it because it turned out to be a bad strategy. It didn't work. And I applied that experience to what I see in terms of Common Core. My basic philosophy is this. I don't think you need to over-test kids in 3rd grade and 4th grade in that level. If you want to test 5th grade, elementary into middle, 8th grade, middle into high school, fine. But keep local control of schools. Let the local school district make those determinations. You have districts all around us that are doing terrific results, high graduation rates. Kids go to college and perform well. You track the class of 08 through college, through postgraduate, and they're employed in a number of our districts. And I represent quite a few of them. And you could argue it's because of the relative wealth, but whatever it is, don't fix what ain't broke. But we do have problems in our urban districts and in our rural poor districts. We don't have any of those around this area. But so the people who have these academic theories, apply them where you know you need it. We have a crisis in the urban setting of education. So you need pre-K. You need after school. You need to keep these kids in a classroom setting, not out in the streets. And I grew up in a poor neighborhood in Mount Vernon, so I understand, it's a few years ago, but I understand that dynamic. So in general, my position is Common Core, what it means in all these different programs I've talked about, is a new way to deliver education. It's unproven. I would go back to the tried and true way, local control of schools. And if you're a mom, you go down and talk to the principal, the teacher, the principal. If you don't like it, you talk to the school board trustee that you can meet for coffee in the coffee shop in the town you live in. Don't put the power totally in Albany or Washington, D.C. to make these decisions.
Got it. And there's something called opt-out, because you can opt out of all the testing.
Well, you have the right as a parent to opt out from taking these mandatory tests. However, Dr. John King, who was the New York State Commissioner of Education, he's now the U.S. Commissioner of Education. I've had great difficulty with him. You could Google, George Latimer, John King, and watch what I had to say to him in a meeting. But he is a strong proponent of these theories, and he is trying to punish school districts by withholding federal funds if their opt-out numbers go above a certain percent. Now, what is he trying to do? He's trying to get the school district to push the parents not to opt out. If you have a right to opt out, you have that right to opt out. My job is to try to give you a reason to show that your education is working, not to tell you, no, you can't opt out of it. So I do believe we ought to step back from the testing. So one more thing and then I'm done.
Take your time.
When you have constant teaching to the test.
Right.
The kids are stressed.
That's
the teacher's
right.
stressed. And by the way,
What
when
are
are you
they
going to take
learning?
them to the botanical gardens?
That's right. That's right.
When are you going to take them so a
When they're
kid
gonna have
goes
fun?
and looks and says, wow,
That's
this
right.
is fascinating. I
That's
love
right.
this. I remember things that made me feel closer
That's right.
to education. It wasn't all just lecture and repeat in classroom.
That's right.
When you get to college, that's fine.
That's right.
Grad school, that's fine.
Right.
You have to prove yourself out
Right.
in the world by then. But a third grader,
Right.
a fourth grader,
Right.
these kids are just starting to get a love for learning. You can't do this to them. So that's where I come down on all of this.
And I like that because you're right. I know going to school, I was a good student. I enjoyed school. I grew up in the Bronx. You know, we didn't have a lot of land around us, but went out,
Right.
we played, we had relay races. It was
Yeah.
part of the day.
Right.
They don't even do scriptive writing anymore.
I noticed that.
It's just all testing, and I think it's really taking something
You know,
away from
sometimes
learning.
change is for the better, but not all changes for
Right.
the better. And you have to evaluate change in and of itself each time to determine if it's the right thing to do or not. And you can't automatically assume it's for the best.
So we're going to be able to turn core.
I hope so. I mean, that's my
Get rid of it?
advocacy as a senator, and there are people on both sides of the aisle who feel the same way that I do. There are people who feel the opposite way.
Right.
And we try to make an argument. That's why you have democracy, though.
Right.
And that's the one thing, going back to the frustration,
Yes.
there are people who see things a certain way, and they
Right.
say, this is obviously true. How come everybody doesn't understand it this way? Because not everybody agrees.
That's right.
Even
And it's
in
where
your
you're
own
sitting.
household, you disagree over
That's
things.
right.
So you have to recognize that in a democracy, every voice gets heard, and you have to convince and go back and forth to get to common agreement. And sometimes we don't get to common agreement because it's more about partisanship
Right.
than it is
Right.
about, doing the right thing.
I know. And you know what else? We were talking about communities, and one of the communities. You're right. What the communities
I
you
live in Rye.
represent,
I
right.
grew up in Mount Vernon. I
Right.
live in Rye City, right by Playland.
Okay.
Good place to park in my driveway.
I
if you
can.
ever- Yeah, you
Okay.
can.
Perfect.
Call in advance.
I'll call in advance.
Save yourself $10. It's got to be worth a couple of hot dogs at Playland.
I'll absolutely. But the areas that you represent are.
Well, it's just going to sound like a Metro North conductor.
No, it's
so my district starts, if you're looking at a mental
Right.
map of Westchester, in Yonkers. I have the eastern half of Yonkers.
Right.
And the district is an irregular crescent that goes up to Bedford.
Okay.
So I would say it's gerrymandering. It's from the casino to Carramore. It's a
Right.
big sweep of things. But it includes all of
Right.
Bronxville, Eastchester, Tuckahoe, Larchmont, Mamaroneck, Rye, Portchester, Rybrook, Harrison, Armonk, North White Plains, Bedford, Bedford Hills.
Wow.
It has part of
Right.
Yonkers, New Rochelle, White Plains, and Katona.
Big area.
It's a big area. It's
And
about a third
very
of Westchester
and
County.
it's very diverse.
Well, you have Portchester and you have
Right.
Bronxville.
That's right.
Now, when people say you represent the people of Bronxville and the
That's
people
it.
of Portchester
That's
have
right.
differences.
That's right. That big differences.
It's big differences.
And people of Yonkers.
And people of Yonkers. And Yonkers itself is a huge city with
city.
diversity just within the city itself. And if you live in a community the size of the village of Larchmont,
Right.
6,000 people,
Right.
Or the village of Rybrook, 10,000 people, your relationship to local government is completely different than if you live in Yonkers.
That's right. It's
And
big.
so you have to realize that there are different ways that people feel about their government. Some of these communities have nonpartisan government. Rybrook, there's no party politics in Rybrook. A number of these communities have unpaid local officials.
Right.
I was a Rye City councilman, no salary,
Right,
no
right.
salary in Larchmont.
Right.
But other places, it's a different kind of position. So you deal with each community within its own personality as best as you can to represent them.
And now when you talk about such a diverse, from Yonkers to Bedford, the environment is so different also
Right.
in both those areas. So tell me a little bit about what you feel about what's going on in our environment and global warming and what's going on.
Well, I think the most important thing is that right now we're going to have to decide as a society. Do we believe that science is telling us something important? And if it is telling us that, what are we going to do to respond to that? I don't think, tomorrow you take a severe set of actions and you strip industries and you shut them down. I don't believe in that. But I do believe that global warming is serious. I know there are people out there who don't believe it's
know.
true.
Crazy.
But what I have read, and I've read from 95%, to use an arbitrary number, of the scientists have argued that the greenhouse gas effect is real, it's
Right.
not fake. And if that's the case, then we need to plan how we're going to move toward greater renewables.
Right.
I don't say shut down fossil fuel
Right.
development. That's
Right.
not realistic.
That's right.
But you're going to have to look at how you move to that. So you're going to need to take a more aggressive attitude towards solar. And when somebody says, well, why are you picking on the solar industry? Because it doesn't have the effect of
That's
adding
right.
to the greenhouse gases. I would tell you this, though, that, and it's a bad analogy, but it's a good analogy. When I was a kid, the the Surgeon General came out with a report on smoking.
Right.
And it said smoking could be hazardous to your health.
That's right.
That's before it got to the point where they determined it could kill you.
I remember.
Or will kill you. My mom and dad were both smokers. My dad stopped. My mother didn't. And I love both of them. My mother's a wonderful, wonderful woman. But she had reasons not to stop, and she pointed to other people who were still smoking. And my father outlived my mother by how many years? 12 years, 8 years. And it's how you take the warning. Do you take it seriously? He took it seriously. He was a man of great will. You know, I didn't mess with my father. When he said, I'm stopping smoking, he stopped.
He stopped.
You know, and I've never smoked, so I know it's a very hard thing to do, so I don't fault my mother. But I think it's the same thing in terms of global warming. You have a warning. How do you respond to the warning? Do you try to say, no, it's not real? Oh, I have this other scientist that tells me it's not real? Or do you look at it and you say, this is plausible. Let us have an intelligent, phased response to this. And that's what I favor. And
I think there's so much proof out there. I mean, just look how hot it's been, you know, when the weather's changing and the ice is melting, you know, and I'm not an expert on all of this, but it's just...
Well, none of us is laymen are. But I have to tell you, and that's why I say you have to have some sense. If you read as an average citizen, you know, information that has a science background, that is the better way to draw your opinion than what you feel. I could feel a lot of things. I could feel like, you know, the Mets are going to win the World Series this year, but I got no way to prove that.
That's right.
But if you can show, you know, some reasonable proof, and then you can say this is a plausible concern. And that's the same story about smoking. Initially, people said that's a bunch of bunk. People have been smoking for years. Then they found out science was right.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, we talk about smoking, and you're in Rye and the other areas, the heroin epidemic. I mean, you're seeing families, you must...
Devastated. Well, let me tell you, my next-door neighbor, I won't identify them by name, but wonderful people, professional people, young son, shoot hoop, right next door to the hedge in my driveway, and young athletes, got a sports injury, some pain medication, got into the wrong crowd, got addicted, died. 18 years old, gone forever. A tragedy that you can't, you know. Now, but here's the reality of it. I mentioned I grew up in Mount Vernon. I grew up in a very poor neighborhood. It was all African American. This crisis has been going on for a long time in a lot of places. Now it's hitting every place. It's hitting the affluent communities and the middle-class communities, people of all different ethnic backgrounds. When it was just hitting some people, people didn't see it as a crisis. It was a crisis all the way through. So now we have had, I think the state Senate and Assembly has done a good bipartisan job of making an initial step. We've allocated more money for various programs, and we also have dealt with some legislation on the major areas, education, treatment, recovery, and enforcement. But as long as there's a demand for these drugs, and to get inside a person's head, a young person or an older person's head, the demand side, there are cartels out there that make a profit off of doing this.
Absolutely.
And the demand will be met. I personalize it this way. I have a weight problem. I have trouble, you know, avoiding that piece of pie, and I know I shouldn't eat it, or eating, you know, the food I love to eat. And it's hard for me, knowing what I know, to still resist. So how much harder is it when you become addicted to something like that? So this is not something we just lecture people or you lock them up. You need to have a multifaceted program from education through enforcement, but we got a long way to go. But we've made a start.
We have.
And we've made a bipartisan start.
And
that's
you've
important.
made a start.
Well, I've contributed to it.
I have to tell you, you're my hero. We came to your office, Ellen Morehouse and myself and people in treatment, various treatment programs. We sat, you gave us the time, and you shared, you said very honestly, I don't know about this, but you talked about the food, and that's an issue. You picked up the phone, and you sponsored the bill that was passed that Governor Cuomo signed June 22nd. And I have to tell you, at that moment, you really did become my hero.
Well, you're very kind.
You picked up the phone. You didn't hesitate.
Well, see, here's the thing, Lillian, and I don't know, we're probably very late on time here, but there's a perception nowadays in this world, this goes back to what we said before, all politicians are corrupt. We're stupid. We're venal. We live in a world that doesn't understand the way the real world works. And for some, that's true. And for some that get convicted of crimes, that proves that this is the way. But it's not universal.
It's not universal.
I have the same interests and desires as anybody else does. I'm a sports fan. I have a granddaughter, 1 year old. I fuss over her. I'm interested when I see somebody driving a cool car, a model antique car. Wow, how does this work? Open up the hood. Let's look at it. So, and I hope what that means is when you and Ellen and others came to me and talked to me about these issues, I didn't react like, well, we have to have a political. You try to listen.
That's right.
You try to observe and you try to be sensitive to it. And I hope in public office that I'm a public official, not just a politician, somebody who only cares about the politics of getting elected.
You're not, because people hold you in very high regard, I have to tell you.
Well, they don't see me when I procrastinate doing things, You don't see the lawn get cut all that often around me, So I certainly have my weaknesses.
Well, okay, I didn't say you don't have to be perfect.
Nobody's perfect.
It's a process.
It is a process.
And we have only a few more minutes left, but I would go back talking about addiction is that, I'm out in St. Vincent's and a lot of treatment programs. We have the Delancey Street Foundation following us. It's that everyone is out there trying to do their part, and the government is giving us more money, and we just have to just keep giving it to people and getting them into treatment.
The first President Bush talked about 1,000 points of light. And I think that's the way you have to look at it. It is not just what the government does. Right. It is 1,000 different points of light. And what happens at St. Vincent and Delancey Street Foundation, who people will see that interview, I guess, next week after this program airs, those are points of light.
That's right.
And we need all of them.
That's right. That's right. And we are out of time. And I want to thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Just keep talking.
Okay.
Because we're still
I'll just nod my head.
Yeah.